It's Game Boy World, and this is football times 2. So, feetball? There's something I've always found strange about sports. Well, okay, there are lots of things I've always found strange about sports, but specifically about the name soccer. The sport known almost universally around the world as football is called soccer in exactly 2 countries, the United States and Japan. Why? I have no idea. But facts is facts, and football for the rest of the world is soccer in the US and saka in Japan. America, of course, has its own brand of football, a sort of rugby variant, and Japan, well, it doesn't really have a game called football, period. So when American football games make their way to Japan, or are developed in Japan, they show up under the name football. You might think with this kindred spirit in place between our 2 great nations, Japan would be able to crank out some pretty good American football games. Either kind of football, honestly. But if the first 2 Game Boy releases in each football category are to be believed, Japan is really terrible at all things football related. April 1990 saw the debut of American football in the form of Konami's NFL football, and soccer football in the form of Sony's Soccer Mania, aka Soccer Boy. And both were honestly pretty terrible renditions of their respective sports. We'll start with Soccer Mania. On one hand, Soccer Mania is kind of impressive. It features what must have been the largest character sprites ever to appear in a Game Boy team sports game. On the other hand, the character sprites are the only good thing about Soccer Mania, and even then, they're kind of disastrous. The sprites are so huge that they basically override every other detail. The soccer field is a dull, flat expanse. The action is cramped and confusing in large part because it's difficult to see team colors. The sprites' giant heads reduce their very important team jerseys to little slivers of darker light that can barely be seen in the heat of action. Especially given the insane level of sprite flicker on display here. We're talking Pac-Man on Atari 2600 degrees of flicker. With so many giant player sprites on screen at once, the Game Boy hardware has to flick sprites on and off on a per-frame basis in order to keep from choking on its own vomit. Between the poor design of the players, the sprite overload, and the general defects of the Game Boy screen, Soccer Mania becomes essentially unplayable. To make matters worse, this is a team sport that makes it incredibly difficult to select the current active team member. You tap B to activate the player closest to the ball, who will begin flop sweating. Or that's the idea anyway. In practice, it's almost impossible to control which player will become active, and it's rarely the one you want. In the thick of a defensive scrum, this is a disaster. By the time you've cycled through to the correct player, the opposing team will quite likely have carried the ball forward beyond the sweaty defender. Offense isn't much better, and you frequently find yourself kicking the ball blindly upfield and hoping there's someone up there to receive it. The CPU has an uncanny knack for stunning your players, to knock defenders out of action or steal the ball from attackers, something you can do in theory, but with far less consistency than the computer. In short, this is an absolutely terrible rendition of soccer, both in terms of technology and playability. It appears to be a Game Boy port of an NES game called Power Soccer, which was developed by the same studio and uses a very similar visual style. Power Soccer, however, used the NES's screen dimensions to give players a glimpse of an entire half of the pitch. Unfortunately, Soccer Mania uses NES-sized sprites and the Game Boy's resolution, meaning you can only see about a quarter of each half of the field at any given time. That's an eighth of the field total for you math experts. Power Soccer may have been perfectly fine, but this conversion is garbage, utterly and completely. And little wonder. Its developer, one Kitty Group, has exactly 2 games to its credit, this and Power Soccer. I can't seem to find any concrete information on Kitty Group, though a talent agency currently operates under that name in Japan, serving primarily as the management for the girl band Scandal. The name Kitty prodded a dim memory though, so I did some digging, and there seems to be some sort of connection between Kitty Group and Kitty Film, a defunct animation studio best known for producing the Ranma 1/2 anime. According to Wikipedia Japan, Kitty Film was part of Kitty Enterprise, which also ran Kitty Music, which was tied to Polydor, nay Polygram, nay Universal Music. Given that music label Epic Sony Record published Soccer Mania in Japan, this makes sense. There was something of a trend during the Famicom boom era of random media labels making a desultory stab at game development. The most prolific was probably Pony Canyon, which also had a tie to Kitty Film as the licensor for Ranma 1/2 soundtracks. But there were plenty of others. Sony, Victor, and of course jazz label Meldak, who brought us HEIANKYO Alien. No doubt, Kitty Group simply outsourced the development of its soccer games to some other ghost studio. One can only assume they were so horrified by the results that they abandoned all hope of game development and went back to making Ranma cartoons or whatever. In any case, Soccer Mania is real bottom barrel stuff. The worst kind of slapdash Famicom boom garbage. Shockingly, it somehow saw a US release despite this, showing up in the States about 2 years after its Japanese debut. By this point, Nintendo had already published Nintendo World Cup, a conversion of one of Technos' infinite array of Kunio-kun sports titles for Game Boy, which means Soccer Mania was outclassed and dead on arrival in the US. About the only thing Soccer Mania did well was to make its contemporary football release, Konami's NFL Football, look vastly better by comparison. NFL Football arrived in the US around the same time that Soccer Mania hit Japan, April 1990. It's not a particularly good take on American football, but it absolutely outclasses Soccer Mania in every way. For starters, it uses a sensible, pulled-back perspective. Player characters are tiny, and there's little differentiation possible between teams to that size, so the action can be confusing once the ball is snapped. Still, at least you're seeing a fair chunk of the field at any given time. Konami also went to the trouble of grabbing the NFL license, though not the Players Union license, so while you're playing as real teams, you won't see any 1990-era player names. That's the good of it. There is, I'm afraid, plenty of bad. For starters, I can't determine any real differentiation between the teams. Reading online, it seems like the 49ers are considered to be the strongest team here, but I honestly can't figure out why or how they're any better than the other teams. Plays in NFL football amount to selecting one of about 6 offensive or defensive plays from a playbook, then letting the CPU do its thing while you control a single character. The game presumes you have a clue about the nature of its plays. Not only does it not offer any guidance on team traits, it also doesn't make any effort to explain the playbook diagrams. Now granted, that's par for the course for a sports game of this vintage, but most of the time you can count on the manual to sort things out for you. Not for NFL football. Konami has put together the saddest, scabbiest excuse for a manual I've ever seen on Game Boy. Konami developed this one in-house, it seems, but strictly for the American market. That's a first, actually. Game Boy's first US-only release. Of course, it's a football game. To my knowledge, Konami's 1990 NFL Football for Game Boy has no relation to Atlas and LJN's NFL Football for NES from 1989. Both games look and play quite differently from one another. This appears to have been Konami's first attempt at producing an American football game, which perhaps explains its mediocrity given the company's general excellence in this era. Still, it must have done reasonably well for them, since they'd go on to make quite a few more football titles for the US market, some NFL licensed and some not. In this case, what you have, though, is a fairly generic sports game without much substance or strategic depth. Like so many Game Boy games we've seen already, it did the job for gamers hungry for a mild diversion back in 1990, but not much more, and it certainly doesn't hold up. But at least it wasn't Soccer Mania. Next on Game Boy World, a bizarre attempt to fancy up one of the oldest video game concepts ever.